Hello, this lesson is about Vinay and Dublnit's model of translation. It is designed specifically for the fourth semester students. The main objective of the lesson is to introduce the fourth semester students to the 7 translation procedures proposed by Vinay and Dublnit in their book Stylistique comparée du français et de l'anglais, translated in 1995 as Comparative Stylistics of French and English. And by the way, this is one of the most important books on translation because it allows us to understand the linguistic changes that take place when moving from one language to another language, that is, when translated. Anyway, in this book, Vinay and Dublnit, as you can see from the chart, propose 2 broad translation strategies. The first translation strategy is called direct translation, and the second translation strategy is called indirect or oblique translation. These 2 broad translation methods or strategies are then broken down into more specific procedures. Direct translation consists of 3 procedures. First, borrowing, Calc, and literal translation. Whereas indirect or oblique translation covers 4 translation procedures: transposition, modulation, equivalence, and adaptation. So before we move to study each procedure individually, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that direct translation procedures are used mainly when the source language and the target language belong to the same language family. In other words, when there is linguistic, stylistic, structural correspondence between the 2 languages entering the translation process, in this case we use direct translation procedures. However, when there are huge or major structural dissimilarities between the 2 languages, between the source language and the target language, in this case we use indirect or oblique translation procedures. So now we will study each procedure individually. Let's begin by direct translation procedures. We start with borrowing. Borrowing is applied when we take a word directly from the source language and we use it as it is in the target language without translation. And this procedure is used mainly to fill semantic gap or linguistic lexical gap. That is, sometimes when we are translating, we come across a concept which is not known for the target language reader. So in this case, we borrow this concept from the source language and we use it as it is in the target language. Of course, we can add some explanation. here are some, and for borrowing, there are two types of borrowing. We have loan words. In this type of borrowing, the spelling of the borrowed word is kept as it is in the target language. For example, when we translate a word like aspirin, it is translated as aspirin. It is written in Arabic letters as it is pronounced in English. The same can be said about phoneme, which is translated as phoneme, and morpheme, which is translated as morpheme. So the second type of borrowing is called transliteration. The word is not, or the spelling of the word is not retained in translation, but rather it is phonologized to reflect the phonological system of the target language. In other words, a word like, for example, democracy is translated as demokratia, which means this word, the spelling of this word, is not retained in translation, although it is borrowed. But it is made to fit Arabic spelling, Arabic grammar, Arabic pronunciation. The same can be said about the word imperialism. It is translated as imperialia, and the word bourgeoisie, which is translated as bourgeoisia. So for these words, they are made to fit Arabic pronunciation, spelling, and grammar. Now we'll move to the second type of indirect translation procedures, the second procedure, which is Calc. This is a special kind of borrowing where an expression is introduced into the target language by literally translating it from the source language with no grammatical or semantic adjustments. In other words, Calc takes place when the translator takes an expression from the source language and translate literally its components. Okay? And again, we have two types of Calc. We have lexical or semantic Calc, and this occurs when a target language expression is calqued on a source language expression, retaining the same word order and the same primary meaning of the lexical elements. An interesting example of lexical calc is the translation of many English idioms into Arabic. Here are some examples. So, to put pressure can be translated either as dagata or marasa dagtan. When we use calc, we translate it as marasa dagtan. The same can be said about to have breakfast. Although in Arabic we have the verb aftara, translators tend to use calc and translate it as tanawala futuran, and the same can be said about to ask permission from. Although we have the verb ista'dhana in Arabic, translators, because of the influence of foreign languages, mainly English and French, they tend to calc these expressions on English. Okay? That's why an expression as to ask permission from is translated as talab al-idn min walaysa ista'dhana. And again, we have the second type of calc, which is structural calc. This type of calc occurs when we introduce a source language structure into the target language, which means we take the grammatical structure of the source language and we use it in the target language. So although I don't have examples from English into Arabic, we can use examples from French. The expression science fiction, for example, is translated into French as science fiction. So the word science modifies fiction, which means it has an adjectival function. And normally in French, the adjective comes after the noun and not before the noun. So here in this example, we introduce a new grammatical structure into French. And this grammatical structure is calqued on English, because in English the adjective comes before the noun and not after the noun like in French. Okay? Now we will move to the third procedure, which is literal translation. This procedure occurs when the source text is translated word for word into the target language. Literal translation is commonly used between languages of the same family and culture. But if the source language and the target language do not share the same linguistic structures, literal translation may sound unnatural. In this case, or although English and Arabic are members of different language families, literal translation from English into Arabic is sometimes possible and meaningful when the stylistic and syntactic features of Arabic are respected and the meaning rendered. So although English and Arabic do not belong to the same language family, it is sometimes possible to translate literally from English into Arabic, but when we use this type of or this procedure, when the stylistic and the syntactic features of Arabic are respected. These are some examples. He reads a book is literally translated into Arabic as يقرأ كتابا. And so, although it is literally translated, this translation is acceptable because the syntactic and the stylistic features of Arabic are respected in this sentence, and the meaning contained in the English sentence, he reads a book, is rendered in the translated sentence يقرأ كتابا. The same can be said about the second example. The end justifies the means. الغاية تبرر الوسيلة. So this translation is acceptable because the syntactic and the stylistic features of Arabic are respected, and because the meaning also is rendered. Now we will move to indirect translation procedures, which are four: transposition, modulation, equivalence, and adaptation. We will start by transposition. Transposition is used when we translate using a different part of speech, which means in the source text we have one part of speech but when we translate, we use another part of speech. For example, in the source text, we have a verb, but when translating, we use a noun. Or in the source text, we have a noun, but when we translate, we use an adjective or an adverb, etc. So, transposition also occurs when we change the position of the sentence, but of course without changing the meaning of the message. And finally, transposition occurs when changing the singular to the plural, etc. So, transposition, there are two types of transposition. We have obligatory transposition. In this case, there is no other way of translating the word into the target text in its existing form. I mean, in this case, the translator is obliged to use transposition. He is obliged either to change the part of speech into another, used in the source text into another part of speech in the target text, or he is obliged to change the position of the sentence. And the second type of transposition is optional, which means the translator, for stylistic reasons, decides to change the form of the word. In other words, the translator is faced with two choices, and his choice is most of the time stylistically motivated. Here are some examples of an obligatory transposition. And this example, a narrow and deserted street in deep shadow, is translated as شارع ضيق مهجور غمرته ظلال حالكة. So in this example, the phrase a narrow and deserted street, which is composed of an adjective, a narrow, and an adjective, deserted, and a noun, street, is translated into Arabic by شارع ضيق مهجور, which is structured as noun plus adjective plus adjective. Okay? So in this example, the translator is obliged to translate it this way. There is no other way to translate this sentence. So this is an example of an obligatory transposition. As far as an optional transposition, the second part of that sentence exemplifies optional transposition. So the translator, in that example, could have literally rendered the prepositional phrase in deep shadow by an Arabic prepositional phrase في ظل عميق. Instead, he has chosen to render it by a verbal phrase غمرته ظلال حالكة. Okay, so in this example, the translator is faced with two choices. The first one, غمرته ظلال حالكة, and the second choice is في ظل عميق. But for stylistic reasons, the translator opts for غمرته ظلال حالكة. Another example, and another clear example of optional transposition is when he arrived. This sentence can be translated either as عند وصوله or عندما وصل. So عندما وصل is literal translation, but if the translator for stylistic reasons choose عند وصوله, then we can say that he opts for transposition. So transposition can be either optional or obligatory. When there is no other way of translating the word in its existing form, we are talking about obligatory transposition. But when the translator has choices, but he opts for a choice for stylistic reasons, then we talk about optional transposition. Well, now the second procedure, which is modulation. Modulation takes place when we translate using another points of view. In other words, when the same idea is expressed differently in the source language and in the target language. The translator should be aware that the two languages may not use the same means to express the same idea. And again, we have two types of modulation. We have fixed modulation. Fixed modulation can be found in dictionaries, which means fixed modulations are recorded in dictionaries or proposed by writers and translators in the past and accepted in the target language everyday usage. Example, the source language, honeymoon. Honeymoon in dictionary is translated as shahr al-asal. So we have here different linguistic means to refer to the same thing. And this is fixed modulation because it is recorded in dictionaries. Because normally shahr al-asal means honey month and not honeymoon. Okay? But again, this is modulation because we express the meaning contained in the source language using a different points of view, different linguistic means. The second type of modulation is free modulation. And free modulations are those which are not recorded in dictionaries but are proposed by the translator. Example, no vacancies is translated as mahjuz. Outside the building, أمام البناية. To be on duty, مجند. The exam was difficult. لم يكن الامتحان سهلا. So in these examples, the linguistic means are different between the source language and the target language, but they refer to the same thing. But this is free modulation because they are not recorded in dictionaries. These are just propositions of translators. Okay? They are proposed by the translator. For example, the exam was difficult could be translated as كان الامتحان صعبا. But the translator uses a different points of view to refer to the same thing. That's why we say that this is a modulation and it is a free modulation because this is not recorded in dictionaries but just proposed by translators. Now we will move to the third procedures included in indirect translation. An equivalence refers to instances where the source text and the target text describe the same situation but using different stylistic or structural means. It is generally used when translating proverbs and idioms because these are usually very culture-specific expressions, and one cultural expression doesn't mean the same or may not mean anything for the target language reader. Here are some examples. رجع, examples of translation by equivalence. رجع صفر اليدين أو رجع بخفي حنين. So if we translate this sentence literally, which means we translate the components of these expressions literally as they are used in the source language, they will mean nothing for the target language reader. That's why we look for a different or an equivalent expression in the target language, which means the same thing as the expression used in the source language. So, رَجَعَ بِخُفَّيْ حُنَيْن is translated as to return empty-handed. The same can be said about مِنْ كَثْرَةِ الْمَلَّاحِينَ غَرَقَتِ السَّفِينَةِ. So, too many cooks spoil the broth. So, although these expressions are different, but they mean the same thing. I mean, linguistically speaking, they are different, but in terms of meaning, they mean the same thing. Okay? Al-ibnu sirru abih. He is a chip of the old block, etc. And the last example, kathiru ramad. If we translate, for example, this expression, literally, it means full of ash. If we say to an English speaker or a native speaker, full of ash, he will not understand the message as it is conveyed in Arabic, Kathir ramad. Because in Arabic, we use this as a symbol of generosity. So, Kathir ramad is translated as very generous. And this is the most appropriate equivalent for this expression in the target language. The last procedure is adaptation. Adaptation is used when the situation referred to by the source language message is unknown in the target language culture. In this case, the translator has to come up with a situation in the target text that could be seen as equivalent to the source target situation. Adaptation means the situation which the message refers to is unknown, does not exist in the target language culture. So in this case, the translator has to bring another situation in the target language culture that could be seen as equivalent. For example, the sight of those apples announced the reopening of school is translated as كان منظر الدفاتر والأقلام والمحافظ المدرسية يشير إلى الدخول المدرسي. So, the situation referred to in the source language, apples, is different from the situation referred to in the target language, الدفاتر, الأقلام والمحافظ. So, two different situations, but the message is kept. Because in England, it is so customary, so common for school children to have apples as sandwich. So the sight of apples in front of grocers in September reminds one of the new school year. Thus, in translating the above sentence, the apples could be conveniently substituted by copybooks, pencils, and bags. The same can be said about camel. Camel, in an Arabic text, can be translated as a horse in an English text. So when we talk about adaptation, we talk about different situations. The translator, because the situation or the source language situation is not known, doesn't exist in the target language culture. That's why the translator has to come up with another situation which could be seen as equivalent for the source language situation. So thank you for your attention.